The phone jolted me awake at 6:00 a.m., its shrill ring cutting through the stillness of my city apartment like a knife. On the other end was Mrs. Thompson, my grandfather's neighbor for 4 decades, her voice trembling with urgency as she said, "They're building houses on your property. Big yellow machines started digging yesterday. You need to come quick." At first, I thought she'd lost it, her words muddled by age or confusion, but she wasn't one for tall tales. She'd watched over Grandpa Joe's 200-acre farm outside Meadow Creek ever since I could remember. I inherited that land when he passed last March, a sprawling piece of earth that had been in our family for generations, though my busy job kept me tethered to the city, far from its quiet fields. She went on, breathless. "The Sunny Pines people put up signs, nearly 100 luxury homes where your east fields are." My stomach twisted. This wasn't a mistake. It was a violation, and before she finished, I was already tossing clothes into a suitcase, the phone cradled against my shoulder. 5 hours later, tires crunching over the dirt road to Grandpa's farmhouse. I broke every speed limit to get there, my mind racing faster than the car. The familiar path felt alien now, the countryside's peace shattered by the growl of machinery, dust clouds billowing above the trees as I crested the hill overlooking the eastern fields. What I saw stopped my heart. Bulldozers and excavators clawing into the soil where Grandpa once grew corn and soybeans, workers in hard hats swarming like ants, orange spray paint scarring the earth. A glossy sign loomed by the road. "Future home of Sunny Pines East. 96 luxury homes starting at $450,000. I parked, legs shaky, and approached a woman standing apart from the chaos, her beige pants spotless despite the dust, clipboard in hand, phone pressed to her ear. She finished her call and I said, "Excuse me, what's happening here?" She sized me up, her smile tight, and replied, "We're preparing for residential development. I'm Diane Reynolds, Sunny Pines Homeowners Association president." Her handshake cold as she extended it. "This is my land," I said, ignoring her hand, my voice steady despite the anger boiling inside. "My grandfather, Joe Miller, owned this farm. He died recently, and I inherited it." Diane's smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened as she said, "There must be some misunderstanding. Sunny Pines purchased this parcel last year, all permits and approvals in place." I shook my head, insistent. "That's impossible. Grandpa would never sell this land." She shrugged, almost pitying. "Perhaps he didn't tell you. The sale finalized 9 months ago. We've planned this for years." My mind reeled. Grandpa had been sick in his final months, but his mind was a steel trap. He'd never part with his legacy without a word to me. "I need to see those documents," I demanded, and she handed me a business card, her tone dismissive. "Contact our legal department, but everything's in order. Now, if you'll excuse me, we have a schedule." She turned away, already dialing, leaving me standing there as machines tore into my family's past. Back at the farmhouse, Mrs. Thompson waited on the porch, a pitcher of iced tea beside her, worry etched into her face. "They started measuring 3 months ago," she said. "Joe was furious, kept saying they had no right, that they were stealing what wasn't theirs." I asked if he'd ever mentioned selling, and her eyes watered. "Never. Joe swore this farm would stay in your family forever." She paused, then added, "The day before his last hospital trip, he was in his office, looking for something important to protect the farm." That night, I stepped into Grandpa's untouched office, the air thick with pipe tobacco and memories, knowing answers hid among his meticulous records, and I wouldn't stop until I found them. Grandpa's office was a time capsule, shelves groaning under the weight of farming almanacs, family photo albums, and decades of records scribbled in his neat handwriting. Rainfall totals, crop yields, every repair logged like a diary of the land. I hadn't touched it since his funeral, the grief too raw, but now urgency drove me as I hunted for proof to stop Sunny Pines from bulldozing my inheritance. The filing cabinet seemed the logical start, its drawers stuffed with folders sorted by year, but hours slipped by with nothing. No sales, no hint of Sunny Pines, just faded receipts and tax forms mocking my exhaustion. Night pressed against the windows, the lamplight flickering as my eyes burned, and just as I slumped back, ready to quit, my foot nudged a loose floorboard under the desk. It shifted, a hollow creak breaking the silence. Kneeling, I pried it open with a letter opener, revealing a small metal box tucked inside, its key dangling from a nail beneath the desk like a secret waiting for me. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid, finding the deed to the farm, Grandpa's will nomming me heir, and yellowed surveys curling at the edges. But the real treasure was a letter in his familiar scrawl, addressed to me. "If you're reading this, someone's trying to take what's ours." His words hit like a punch. He'd known this fight was coming, had seen developers circling his land for years, pressuring him to sell, and in his final months, a Sunny Pines man kept showing up with papers for a road easement, each visit more insistent. "I never signed away my land," he wrote. "If they say I did, it's a lie. Look at the 1910 survey, compare it to the counties now. The truth in the boundaries." I dug out the original survey, its lines sprawling across 280 acres. Not the 200 I'd always known, stretching far beyond what I'd imagined. Sleep was a lost cause that night. I spread the papers across the kitchen table, the old survey beside newer maps, tracing how the eastern boundary had shrunk over decades, swallowing not just the construction site but land under Sunny Pines, existing clubhouse and homes. At dawn, my path crystallized. I needed a lawyer, and I needed to unravel Diane Reynolds' game. If she thought she could steal from my family, she'd underestimated the wrong grandchild. By 8:00 a.m., I sat outside Walter Franklin's office, Meadow Creek's only property lawyer, his secretary squeezing me in before lunch despite her surprise at my emergency plea. "So you think Sunny Pines is building on your land?" Walter asked, peering over thick glasses, his bow tie a relic of another era, as I laid out the surveys, 1910, 1978, then the county's current version. His finger following the shifting lines, eyebrows climbing with every inch. "This is highly unusual," he muttered. "Your property extends half a mile east of what's recorded now, covers the new site, their clubhouse, and about 20 homes built 5 years ago." He rubbed his eyes, glasses off. "A boundary dispute this big won't be simple. We need to know how these changes happened." On speaker, the county assessor's office revealed a shock. 1984 showed a tiny easement tweak, but in 1997, a massive cut lopped off 80 acres with scant paperwork. A signature that wasn't Grandpa's. He'd been in the hospital then, recovering from triple bypass surgery. "That's fraud," Walter said gravely, "but proving it after all these years is tricky." I leaned forward. "What can we do?" He scribbled notes. "File an emergency injunction to halt construction, then petition the court with these surveys. We'll need a professional to verify them." As he drafted the filing, I knew this was just the start. Diane wouldn't back down, but neither would I. Grandpa's trap was already closing around her. Walter's injunction was my first weapon, but I needed more to dismantle Sunny Pines, House of Cards. So I drove to the county records office, my pulse thrumming with purpose as I requested every scrap tied to their development company. Hours later, buried in a dusty corner of the library with stacks of public records, I struck gold. Sunny Pines wasn't just an HOA. It was a tangled web of LLCs and shell companies, 6 names looping through the mess. Diane Reynolds, her husband Thomas, County Commissioner James Harris, Planning Board Director Mark Wilson, and 2 others I didn't recognize. The kicker was a loan approval from 3 months ago, $16 million to fund Sunny Pines East, with my land listed as collateral, a bold move built on a lie I now held proof to unravel. I snapped photos of it all, my phone buzzing with adrenaline, then headed to the Meadow Creek Gazette, where editor Tanya Williams, someone Grandpa knew well, listened as I pitched a story of fraud involving the town's elite, her eyes sharpening with every word. "Accusations need evidence," Tanya warned, but she agreed to dig into the development's fast-tracked approvals, her pen already scratching notes as I left. Back at the farmhouse, Mrs. Thompson was chatting with Mr. Grayson, another neighbor whose face soured at Diane's name. He'd sold his place after relentless HOA fines for tomatoes and a workshop they claimed broke rules they'd invented, one of a dozen old-timers strong-armed into selling cheap to Sunny Pines, hidden companies. "They harassed your grandpa too," Mrs. Thompson said, "but he fought smarter." My phone rang, Walter triumphant. "The judge granted the injunction. Construction stops immediately until next week's hearing. Brace yourself, it'll get ugly." I thanked him, a flicker of victory warming me, and drove to the site with the court order arriving as workers packed up. Diane's black SUV gleaming near the office. She emerged, phone in hand, her composure cracking when I handed her the paper and said, "Construction stops now. Legal boundaries are in dispute. She scanned the order, her voice low. This is ridiculous. We have every approval. But I countered. Based on fraudulent boundaries, I have the original surveys. Uncertainty flickered in her eyes, gone in a flash as she hissed. This stunt will cost you. You don't know who you're dealing with. I hadn't planned to tip my hand, but her smugness pushed me. Actually, I do. 6 names on dozens of filings, $16 million in loans on stolen land, county officials fast-tracking projects they profit from. Her knuckles whitened around her phone, her threat soft but sharp. You're making a mistake. We can be reasonable. How about a 7-figure offer for the farmland, immediate payment? I shook my head. Not interested. This land. Been ours for 4 generations. It's not for sale. She smirked, predatory. Everyone has a price. Think about it. And as I walked away, she called out, Commissioner Harris golfs with my husband. Judge Evans dines at my table. Your injunction won't last. You're nobody here. Her words gnawed at me as I drove back. True enough. I was an outsider now, but Grandpa wasn't. He'd been Meadow Creek's heart, respected even by foes, and he'd left me more than land. In his office, I searched deeper past the surveys, finding a 2018 picnic album. Photos of Grandpa with neighbors, shop owners, families, names scrawled on each back, a network of allies he'd built over a lifetime. Then my phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Parking violation at your property, $500 fine, Sunny Pines HOA compliance, with a photo of my car on my own land. It was starting the harassment Grayson described, but I smiled. Grandpa's secret weapon was still hidden, and Diane had no idea what was coming. The harassment escalated overnight. By morning, concrete blocks barricaded my driveway, courtesy of Sunny Pines, security goons who shrugged. This access hasn't been approved. It's closed for safety. Trapped on my own land, I called the sheriff, but they brushed it off as a civil matter, leaving me fuming as Diane's SUV idled nearby, her presence a silent taunt. Then my phone rang, her name flashing, and her voice dripped honey. Good morning. Enjoying the view. That driveway crosses our common areas. We control access per the real county records. I snapped. You know those records are wrong, and she laughed. Let me explain small-town politics. The commissioner's my husband's golf buddy, the inspector's daughter works for me, the water supervisor lives in Sunny Pines. My gut sank as she continued. By tomorrow, your farmhouse will have 15 code violations. Your water might stop. Contractors won't touch your calls, drop your claims, sign over the acres, and I'll make it worth your while. I growled. This isn't about money, and she purred. It's always about money. Think it over by tomorrow, before hanging up. True to her word, an inspector arrived that afternoon, citing the farmhouse for wiring, septic, even the porch rails, thousands in fixes due immediately, while signs sprouted along my property. Future home of Sunny Pines East. My water dwindled to a trickle, the utility company mumbling about maintenance, and pizza delivery couldn't find my address, a first in years. I was being choked out. That night, Walter texted, They've countersued, claiming your documents are forged, court date in 3 months, they'll keep building meantime. 3 months meant half-finished houses, my leverage gone, but as I scrolled for help, headlights pierced the dark, a car weaving past the barriers. I braced for more trouble, but outstepped Gerald Fisher, Sunny Pines' treasurer, nervous as he whispered, I shouldn't be here if Diane finds out. I cut in, Why are you? He handed me a flash drive. What she's doing isn't right. I've kept the HOA books for 7 years. There's things you need to see. Inside, over my kitchen table, Gerald's laptop unveiled a cesspool. HOA funds siphoned like a personal piggy bank, special fees vanishing, contracts funneled to Diane's family, reserves funneled into insider businesses. He pointed to a spreadsheet. Last year's road repairs, every homeowner paid $2,000. The work cost half that, the rest gone. I muttered, That's theft, and he nodded. And those 20 homes on your land. Residents complain about drainage. Diane promises fixes, but knew they might not be hers to fix. My phone buzzed, texts from strangers. We support you, Diane, find us $500 for veggies, not flowers, Miller's, 42 Sunny Pines Lane. Then, playground equipment removed without notice. Jackson family wants to fight. Gerald smirked. I may have shared your number with friends. For the first time, hope flickered. Diane had power, but she'd bred resentment, and now I had allies she'd never counted on. As Gerald slipped out, rain pattered on the silent bulldozers in the distance. Diane thought she'd cornered me, but she just handed me a coalition. Grandpa always said the best trap isn't one your enemy stumbles into, it's one they build for you, blind to the noose. She overplayed her hand, thinking harassment would break me, but it only sharpened my resolve. Tomorrow, I'd stop reacting and start striking. Those texts were the spark, Gerald's files the fuel, and Diane's arrogance the match. I sat on the porch, the dark field stretching before me, knowing the real fight was dawning, and I'd wield Grandpa's legacy like a blade she'd never see coming. By morning, my water was off, the electricity cut hours later, Diane's siege turning Grandpa's farmhouse into a dark, silent shell, the fridge humming with spoiling food as I stood in the kitchen, fury replacing despair. She thought she could starve me out, but she'd misjudged me. I grabbed my notebook and stormed out, determined to turn her enemies into my army. First stop was Mrs. Thompson, her flowered housecoat flapping as she gasped. "They shut off your utilities? That's illegal." I nodded. So is building on my land, but Diane's got the county in her pocket. I need names, people who hate the HOA as much as we do. She grinned, settling me with tea, and rattled off 15 families. Fine for mailbox colors, threatened with liens over grandkids' visits. A single mom hit with a $900 fee for a toddler's fence. Her list a map of sunny pines, discontent I spent the day following. Knocking on doors, I found fear at first, heads shaking, voices low. But when I showed Grandpa's surveys, proving their tormentor stood on stolen ground, eyes lit with defiance. Sarah Jenkins, her garden ripped out by Diane's decree against unesthetic vegetables, poured lemonade with trembling hands. "She fined us $500. My husband works 2 jobs. The Patels fought for their porch swing, the Johnsons for a non-beige door, every home a clone of beige oppression under Diane's reign. Trevor Martinez summed it up. It's not just rules, it's her whims, warnings for some, fines for others, no fairness. By dusk, 27 families shared their scars, a chorus of outrage building, and I called Walter. "Can we form a rival HOA on my land?" He chuckled. "Absolutely, and those existing homes, that's where it gets fun." I grinned, booked the community center for tomorrow night. They don't own it, I do. Next day, I printed 200 flyers. Emergency community meeting. Your home may be at risk. Survey copies attached, and by nightfall, the center overflowed, 97 families packing chairs and walls, Diane barging in last, her face a mask of fury. "This is unauthorized. Leave now," she barked, but Sarah shot up. "Or what, more fines? Haven't you taken enough?" The room roared approval as I took the front. "I came for my grandfather's stolen land, but you're all victims, too." For an hour, they poured out years of HOA tyranny, tears, shaking voices, a flood Diane couldn't dam, her phone a blur of desperate taps. I raised my hands. "Here's my plan. The Meadow Creek Homeowners Coalition, fair property lines, sane rules, transparent funds." Diane screeched. "You can't. Our contracts bind them." I held up the survey. "Not if they're built on fraud, Ms. Reynolds. I'm fixing this, not destroying it." 89 families joined on the spot, a tide turning as they filed out, buzzing with hope. Then Gerald sidled up, whispering, "The HOA books don't add up. Dues rise, reserves shrink. Diane locks me out." I gripped his shoulder. "Show me tomorrow." And he nodded, darting off as Diane loomed, finger jabbing. "You'll regret this. I've got the commissioner, police chief, judge on speed dial. Your rebellion's dead." She stormed out, slamming the door, blind to the Gazette reporter I'd invited, every threat caught on tape. My phone buzzed. "Walter. Environmental survey. You won't believe what's on that land." I smiled. Diane thought she held the cards, but Grandpa's truth was my ace, and tomorrow it'd hit the front page, her empire trembling as I turned her own game against her. Police cars ringed the farmhouse at dawn, their lights slicing through the fog as I stumbled to the door, spotting Diane beside a tall, uniformed man, Chief Williams, bellowing, "You're trespassing on private property." I kept my cool, handing him a folder. "Actually, Chief, I'm the legal owner. Original surveys and deed inside." Diane snapped. "Those aren't verified." But a woman stepped from an unmarked car. "They are now Carolyn Mitchell County records. We pulled the originals last night after some troubling reports." Diane's face drained as I waved them in. "Coffee's ready, let's talk." 15 minutes later, my kitchen hosted a tense summit. Chief Williams, Carolyn, Walter, and Diane, her polish fraying as Carolyn spread maps. The 1973 boundary shift was botched. This land, including Sunny Pines homes and new site, belongs to the Miller estate. The chief whistled, "Some mistake," but Walter cut in. "Not a mistake, deliberate fraud," sparking Diane's outburst. "This is a scam to extort us." I slid Gerald's financials to the chief. Explain $427,000 in dues funneled to Sunshine Consulting LLC, your son-in-law's firm, plus landscaping, security, all to your family's companies. His face hardened as Diane stammered. That's our management company, legitimate. But he shut the folder. Ms. Reynolds, we need you at the station. She bristled. My husband golfs with Judge Harrington. You know who I am? But the chief let her out, her protests echoing. By afternoon, construction stalled, news vans swarmed, and my phone rang off the hook, homeowners panicking, so I called a town hall at the high school auditorium, the only space big enough for the 400 who showed. Fear crackled as I took the mic. I'm Alex Miller. This was my grandfather's land. I'm not here for trouble, but to honor him. Shouts erupted. Our homes. I'll sue. My savings. And I raised my hands. I've got a solution for everyone. No one loses their home. Existing owners get legal deeds, I said, murmurs softening. And the new development stops until we survey the wetlands Grandpa cherished, critical habitats, flood protection, home to endangered species. Building there's illegal. A man stood. My life savings are in a new lot. What now? I nodded. A property exchange, swap for equal value in a redesigned plan. No one's out a dime. For an hour, I pitched a balanced community. Nature preserved, fair rules, real improvements. Then Sarah Jenkins grabbed the mic. 8 years under Diane, no blue doors, no tomatoes, no kids playing past 7. Is that what we want? By the end, 300 signed for the Meadow Creek Community Association, even Gerald jumping ship to untangle the HOA's mess. Diane's lawyers fought dirty for months, but the evidence crushed them. She took a plea on fraud charges, her empire crumbling. That night I sat with Walter, the Gazette's front page fresh off the press. HOA fraud exposed, land dispute shakes Sunny Pines. He grinned. Your trap worked. She walked right into it. I nodded. Grandpa said it years ago. I just sprung it. The environmental survey Walter mentioned hit like dynamite. Those wetlands weren't just pretty. They were federally protected, a legal hammer Diane couldn't dodge. My phone buzzed. Rachel Winters, a young buyer. I just wanted a home. Thank you for saving us. I exhaled, the weight of it all settling. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about people. And I'd turned Diane's war into their victory, Grandpa's ghost guiding every move. A year later, I sat on Grandpa's porch, the farmhouse humming behind me, not as a relic, but as the Meadow Creek Community Center, alive with classes, meetings, and laughter spilling from its open doors. Kids zipped by on bikes, pedaling past houses with doors painted every shade, red, yellow, blue, freed from Diane's beige tyranny, while the community garden buzzed nearby, Sarah Jenkins, tomatoes towering over laughing neighbors swapping tips. Beyond, the wetlands stretched serene, shielded by a conservation easement, their trails winding past signs explaining the rare plants and animals Grandpa fought to save. His legacy no longer a battlefield, but a sanctuary. Construction had resumed, smaller homes rising with solar panels and green spaces. The redesigned development a compromise that honored the land and its people, a balance I'd clawed from Diane's wreckage. Mrs. Thompson joined me, handing over lemonade, her eyes crinkling. Your grandfather would be bursting with pride. Look at this place. I pointed east where cranes moved again. Smaller, smarter, sustainable, he'd approve. She nodded and I pulled out a faded notebook. Found this cleaning his study, his journal from 30 years ago. He fought the first developers too when they eyed the wetlands. She laughed, stubborn as a mule, just like you always said you. Fight for what's right. I flipped through pages of his tight script, detailing battles with surveyors and slick-talking suits, his quiet war against greed mirroring mine, except he'd armed me with more than grit. Those hidden documents, the surveys, the fraud proof, had been his long game, waiting for me to finish it. A blue heron lifted from the marsh, soaring over homes now woven into the land, not carved from it, and I felt him there, watching. Diane's fall hadn't been clean. Her lawyers dragged it out, countersuing, claiming coercion, but the financial records Gerald leaked and the federal wetland violations buried her. She'd pleaded out, fatting from Meadow Creek like a bad dream. The Gazette's exposé, fueled by the reporter I'd tipped at the meeting, ran for weeks, peeling back layers of her scams, the 6 names tied to every dirty deal unraveling under scrutiny. Commissioner Harris resigned, Wilson's planning board seat emptied, and the town reeled, but from the ashes the coalition grew. 89 families turned to hundreds, rewriting rules, auditing funds, rebuilding trust. Gerald, once her pawn, now led the finance team, untangling years of theft, while Rachel Winters, who'd feared losing her lot, sent me photos of her new home, a thank you note tucked inside. You gave us more than land, you gave us a voice. I sipped the lemonade, the tartness grounding me as Mrs. Thompson mused. Diane thought she'd steal it all, but she handed you something better. She was right. Sunny Pines collapse didn't just save the farm. It birthed a community Grandpa would have loved, one where people mattered more than profit. The journal's last entry, dated a month before he died, read, "They'll come for it again, keep the truth close, it's stronger than their lies." I'd done more than keep it. I'd wielded it, turning Diane's trap into ours, not to destroy, but to build. The sun dipped low, painting the wetlands gold, and I whispered to the empty porch, "I didn't let you down," knowing he'd hear it in the rustle of the fields he'd entrusted to me. The breeze carried the scent of damp earth and blooming wildflowers across the porch, a quiet hymn to the land Grandpa had guarded, now thriving under a sky streaked with the last light of day. I leaned back in his old rocking chair, the creak of its would a familiar echo, watching the community I'd fought for settle into itself. Kids chasing fireflies, neighbors lingering by the garden, the farmhouse-turned center glowing with a potluck's warmth spilling from its windows. The wetlands shimmered in the distance, their protected edges a testament to a victory bigger than me, one rooted in Grandpa's foresight and finished by the coalition we'd forged from Diane's ruin. It wasn't just about holding the line anymore. It was about showing what could grow when greed gave way to something truer, a lesson etched into every colorful door and shared laugh echoing across the fields. Diane's empire hadn't just crumbled. It had been dismantled, brick by fraudulent brick, her plea deal a footnote to the real story. The people she'd underestimated rising to reclaim what was theirs. The Gazette kept digging after her fall, exposing how deep the rot ran. Thomas Reynolds lost his real estate license. Harris and Wilson faced ethics probes, and the web of LLCs unraveled, revealing millions siphoned from homeowners now redirected to repair drainage, build playgrounds, fund the trails I walked with Mrs. Thompson on weekends. She'd taken to calling me Joe Jr., teasing my stubborn streak, but I saw it in her eyes, pride not just for me, but for what we'd all built, a Meadow Creek reborn from the ashes of Sunny Pines, arrogance. Gerald's audits turned up more than missing funds. They found a spirit in the families who'd once cowered, now standing tall, their voices shaping a future Diane couldn't touch. I pulled Grandpa's journal from my pocket, its pages worn from rereading, his final words a compass. The best trap isn't catching them wrong, it's showing them right. Hold the land, but share its soul. He'd known the developers would return, had banked on me finding his hidden box, not to hoard the acres, but to wield them as a bridge, uniting a town fractured by profit. That night at the community meeting, when I'd faced Diane's rage and the crowd's fear, I hadn't just sprung his trap. I'd opened a door, offering deeds to shaken homeowners, swapping lots for the displaced, preserving the wetlands not as a wall, but a heart beating through the redesign. Sarah's tomatoes, the Patels' swing, Rachel's home. They weren't victories over Diane. They were proof Grandpa's way worked. That land could bind us if we let it, a truth stronger than her threats or her husband's golf cronies. As stars pricked the darkening sky, I stood, the porch boards solid beneath me, and walked to the garden where laughter mingled with the hum of crickets. Mrs. Thompson waved me over, her lemonade pitcher empty, the potluck winding down with promises of tomorrow's plans. The heron called from the marsh, its cry a thread tying past to present, and I smiled, knowing Diane's grab for my inheritance had backfired, giving me more than she'd ever grasp, a legacy not stolen but shared. Grandpa's trap had caught her, sure, but its real power was in letting go, turning old dirt into a living promise, one I'd keep for him, for them, for as long as the fields stretched under Meadow Creek's sky.